from my investigation, the system that the world has been set up on has been that of a feudal system. And so as entities begin warring against entities, and as entities begin shipping themselves throughout the world, across the oceans and through the seas, they would put banners up. And banners were the symbol of who was coming to your location or who was on the battlefield. So it came from a concept of feudalism. That concept carried over as ships would make it to other destinations. It would be the manifest of the terms of who was coming to do to conduct business. And so as commissions were paid for ventures and voyages for ships to go across oceans and go across seas, the commission would have what they call goods aboard the vessel, otherwise known as a manifest. And that manifest, as they would go from port to port, location to location, would be the terms of goods to negotiate trade amongst societies, amongst clans. From the native culture, it was not so much banners and flags, it was more symbolisms built around spiritual ideologies.
I see.
So that translated to the native community when the natives worldwide were tricked by a genocide of an agenda to capture their lands, to capture their people. It was conveyed, and they were given and told about the flag etiquette, which was a crime against those native people on a worldwide level. The main culprits for that was the Vatican and the Jesuit Society of Missionaries, who would go from tribal state to tribal state on a global level, learn about their concepts and direct them into this concept of flag etiquette. Oh, they would first carry their flag for their Jesuit order or their Vatican, and that's how that kind of got carried over into the native position. However, from a feudal position, when the sheiks of the Middle East or the monarchs of England and the feudal system, they would have banners to represent who was fighting where, direct columns. This was a feudal concept of flag etiquette. So the flag protocols came from a feudalistic position to give closure on communication of voyages and battlefield positions.
Technically positions. So if you were Christopher Columbus coming over to America in the day, or any of those, even the Spanish Armada, you're coming over, you landed here on these shores, but there is no nation technically set up with a flag. How does that translate? What happens at that point?
They were under the Spanish Armada flags. And so they were in a position where they were under someone else's colors. And those colors would represent the terms of how they were going to conduct business when they got here. And so they were a front runner, like a broker, for those who funded the voyage.
So when they came upon a land where there were no flags, how does one then bridge that gap and interpret that? So the Indians didn't have a flag, these people arrived, here's a flag, now what?
They were tricked in thinking that this flag meant something of protocol. And then as the flag, the greed of man came into place, and they started taking from the native peoples on a worldwide level. You know, slavery is not a new thing, right? Blacks captured blacks, natives captured natives, whites captured whites. It was all feudalism for servitude at that time to get tasks done, to get jobs done. And so the slavery is not just a white ideology, but is a cultural ideology, a feudalistic state on a global level. And it's been happening since the beginning of time.
So when they came in and they would set their position with a flag on the shores where there was no flag, what would it be, a takeover, a hostile takeover at that point?
There would be a hostile takeover, and then behind that, they would use the favorite phraseology of the bad guys, or the bad people running the planet, might makes right. So it had no position of correctness, per se, because they couldn't capture a sovereign land. However, they can trick them, put their flag down and say, these are our terms now that our flag has shown up, which is unfair to the unsuspecting and uneducated cultural differences between societies. So the flag is one position of symbols, as a symbolic state of the government or the corporation that's behind the flag. The flag standard has been changed throughout the years. The flag standard sets the terms of what the meaning of that flag is, changes venues. So when countries come together to negotiate peace and treaty, they have the ball on top of the flag standard. The ball on top of the flag standard is closure that there's a recruitment on contract, that there's a drafting for that contract, we're open for business and we're going to set up terms, and these are the terms that
you'll negotiate at that point.
You're going to negotiate at that point.
Yeah.
Now, with the wings up on the eagle that's on the flag standards, or the bird that's on the flag standards, that is a postal position. Wings down on the bird is a Vatican position, and the spire is a martial law position. In all countries worldwide at the United Nations, when you walk into the embassy, on top of their flag standard is the spire. In governor's offices, as well as prime minister's offices worldwide, the spire is on top. The spire, during times of war, contract is suspended, which means it's the commander-in-chief's will that dictates the terms in the theater. The commander-in-chief's will, he holds the palm of justice in the palm of his hand. And he wields the flag because during times of war theater, the civil servant sector, such as our representatives, our senators, our governors, are all suspended. Their job titles are suspended, as well as state statutes, civil codes, and municipal codes are no longer valid during wartime functions of flag etiquette. And so in the former United States, this is why we see the spire on top of the state flags when you go into a governor's office, because the state constitutions are suspended. Because under the Maritime Commerce Acts of Title 46, the states were supposed to publish commerce and their own money by the year 2001, when the United States government ceased to exist in 1999. Since they did not publish their own commerce, there's no such thing as a state national. There's no such thing as state sovereignty anymore. That was done out the door under knowledge and negligence by the public officials who did not reconstitute their state constitutions by the year 2001, nor did they reconstitute their state governments in 2001, nor did they reconstitute their money. And every state should have coined their own financial system and minted their own terms of finance for their state financial duties.
Where does that leave us with all new flags, such as the Obama flag and the Space Force flag?
Sure. So flags globally were recorded at the International Bureau of Weights and Measures in France, which means every country would file their flag etiquette closure with that corporation to be under the umbrella of the International Maritime Organization out of London. However, in 2004, I challenged the International Bureau of Weights and Measures on the charter that allowed them to function as a corporate entity. And I found that the words on paper for their charters was 100% fraud, which means they were using adverbs, adjectives, and pronouns and had no facts for the statement of a claim. This was a violation of Title 18, 1001 for fictitious grammar. And I called them on the carpet, so the flags now would be registered with the quantum banking system and me, because they don't have the authorization to take a flag anymore. The Obama flag is not registered anywhere on the planet. It is a 2x5 flag with a yellow fringe on it, which has no standing anywhere on the planet. So this is a fake flag. Space Force as well, created by a fake president, Donald Trump, has no authorization or jurisdiction anywhere as well, because the position of president in the United States ended in 1999. Therefore, anything after the year 1999, this is a false ruse placed under the FEMA, Federal Emergency War Powers Act, because there is no continental government anymore, because the United States ceased to exist when they came out of their third and final bankruptcy. The bankruptcy started on July 1st, 1775. Benjamin Franklin, who was a French attorney as well as a British, English barrister, was working surveying lands for Canada and throughout the eastern seaboard of the northern continental United States. Benjamin Franklin was a postmaster. I personally have looked in his books, and he canceled his stamps. He put stamps on his bank contracts. He placed his signature simulation across the stamps with those who also borrowed and lent him the money. So the answer to the question is yes, he was a postmaster, which means he was navigating bills of the lading as a freight forwarder. He was also the postmaster general, which means he was in charge of the postal control for setting up the sea lanes for commerce for the continental United States. And he was a double postmaster general, both in Canada and the continental colonies simultaneously. So he was functioning in two positions.
How could he technically be in two different positions simultaneously?
Well, the education at the time for a postmaster general position was very limited in scope, and he was trained by the monarchies that were in power at the time to be that person. So it came down to knowledge. The first rule of a postmaster general is you have to have knowledge, and he was also what they were doing, maintaining the rules of the continuance of the evidences with their joinder for freight to come on and off our shores.
But does that include North America as a whole at that point, as a territory, or was it divided?
It was divided based upon the survey lines that they were getting themselves into. When the United States government sent Lewis and Clark on their traitorous trail across the continental United States to capture and survey the lands, then they tried to encompass all, because the first rule of contract is closure. They didn't have any knowledge of what was out there. So they hired the U.S. Army as a conquering state, because armies are conquering functions, not capturing functions. The capturing functions are sea-bearing and air-bearing, which is Marines and Navy and so forth. But when you actually occupy a land, that's when you bring in your armies on a worldwide level. Please comprehend that as Postmaster General of our world, not only do I control the United States military's order of operation of functions, but each military on planet Earth. One of the contracts that I have globally was at the Secretary of State's office at the Vatican. And they asked me, because of my knowledge of how postal mechanics work, how militaries are put into theater, both oceanic and land and space. I spent 3 days with them, and they concurred, because of my knowledge position, that I was Postmaster General not only of the former United States, but each army on planet Earth. Some of the questions that are posed to me as I meet with different entities on a global level is, are you the supreme sovereign ruler of each military on planet Earth? Well, I'm a sovereign commander of correctness and facts for militaries to stop wars, to aid the people on the planet, because militaries work for we the people. Unfortunately, the people have been asleep at the wheel, have not comprehended the dynamics of this meritocracy shipping war that's been placed against us from cradle to grave. So what I did was I figured that out, and I positioned myself based upon knowledge and first in line, first in time, which means nobody after I left could hire anyone else, right? Just because I wasn't there, you couldn't spin somebody up and say, oh yeah, Russell's not working here anymore, or not here, yeah, you can be in this position. That's not how this works. I did not leave them the authorization to do that. I took all their authorization away from them and brought it back into my now space so that I convey contract for the citizens, for the militaries in a peaceful manner, so that the flag can now set the terms for the performances that need to be done for we the people. And the people are figuring that out. I know it's a big pill to swallow because they're uneducated on global meritocracies of shipping. But if you break down the concept of how the birth certificate system was being used in our lives to be a tentacle of that meritocracy, you'll find that there's correctness in what I've done, there's correctness in what I've said, and I am this person who I say.
So how does that tie back in now with what you mentioned about Benjamin Franklin and his authorization to even represent the United States in any way, or the colonies in any way, since he basically contracted with France and England? How does that work?
Well, it was a trick against the Founding Fathers. And the trick is that he did not give them full closure that he was a traitor and he was working for two entities at the same time. But he was highly educated in the arts of linguistics at the time. He was fluent in the 7 arbitrary forms of ciphering, which he was a master of. So he knew how to italicize words. He knew how to italicize words in contract whenever are not spelled correct, which means anytime you see a word italicized in contract, it's actually a misspelled word.
So that voids the contract.
So it voids the contract altogether. So because you're breaking the rules of the continuance of evidence by placing it in a different space through the articulation of script.
And he knew this.
Yes, he was very skilled in this, and that's why he had a print press. And when you go to his print press in Philadelphia, all characters in his newspaper were italicized words, or italicized. I've physically been there. This is a true statement, and it's under the National Parks direction. That's who controls when you go there. You go through the national parks. It's actually a museum of a national historical position. In the Benjamin Franklin bank books themselves, at the Benjamin Franklin Post Office in Philadelphia, it has many different bank books of many different drafts. But when you tie in the rules of continuance of evidence to domestic bankruptcies, and domestic bankruptcies run 7 years, and international bankruptcies, which run 70 years, you will see what's called the rules of the continuance of the facts, or the evidence. And how that ties into Benjamin Franklin now is he borrowed 1.6 million francs on July 1st, 1775. Nothing becomes law for 1 year, 1 day, and there's 3-day rescission, which will take you to July 4th, 1776. But he had already filed and borrowed 1.6 million francs from France and filed a domestic bankruptcy with France, which means they've agreed he could pay back the money within 7 years if he could get it done. That took us to 1782. In 1782, he filed another domestic bankruptcy for 7 years because he was still in charge of his ledger of borrowing the money, which took you to 1789.
Was he solely in charge of that?
He was solely in charge, and he was the only one on bank draft with the founding fathers witnessing signing off on it on July 4th, 1776. So they were setting up the terms in which the bankruptcy was to be conducted. And so
you're saying that they were aware of this as well?
Some, yes. Don't know their knowledge basis because I wasn't there, but they were a debtor at that point in 1776. So my question to the general public is, how can a debtor set terms for we the people? This was a fraud against we the people. This was a big farce designed to keep other powers in control of our country, where the whole volition of the settlers who came across and the colonists who came across was to break ties from those countries and those monarchies that were oppressing them back on another continent. They felt like they could come to this continent and move everybody out of the way fraudulently through what's called ailing, which is fraudulent contract, conveying fraudulent contract against the native people that were here, capture them, capture their lands, and give them a whole new paradigm of thinking through grammar and faith concepts. Because the colonists knew, and the financiers behind them knew, that they had to change the thinking, and they do that through our vocabulary, through our phonics, through our phonetics. This creates our world, right, through the grammar. And they trick the natives out of the spoken word and the tonations and the harmonics and the peace and love with that, and they tied them to a commercial tool saying, you need to have an alphabet to write your words down, you need to have a flag, you need to set up, and they moved them into a corporate meritocracy, which was unfair to the native people, at the same time creating a mass genocide. If you didn't believe like the white people, then we would kill you. So it was a double-edged sword of ailing to capture this country, put on by the monarchies from the European states.
So Russell, you are the owner and the copyright holder of the Title IV flag. What's the distinction between being the owner and a copyright holder of any flag?
Yes. So the Title IV 1 to 1.9 dimension flags, Title IV Section 1, 2, and 3, the grammar for claiming the flag was written in modification language, which means they were using adjectives and adverbs to create verbs and pronouns. There were no facts in that statement.
Who were they?
The government styles manual for printing office under the U.S. codes.
So back in the day when the U.S. flag was actually created, is that what you're referring to?
Correct. The grammar that they used was done in a modification state where there were no facts on the page. We saw the United States government was coming out of bankruptcy because we had access to the books.
You mean you and David Wynn-Miller?
David Wynn-Miller, yes.
Your partner.
My partner at the time, yeah. We were cognizant that it was that we had to do something, right? Well, the first rule of contract when you go to a port or a bank or open up any business on a global level is flag etiquette. So we started studying up and brushing up on how to use the flag. And we wrote the copyrights to the flag in quantum grammar, but we filed it at the Post Office of the United Nations to be bearers and owners of the flag. Because the Patent Office, we knew that the United States government was going to have to vacate the estate, which means that the United States Postal Service and the United States Post Office couldn't authorize any functions underneath it, which means it couldn't authorize the U.S. Patent Office because it was going to be a closed entity because the Post Office was shutting down.
In 1999.
In 1999. When we took their flag away from them, that was the certification that they couldn't grab the flag and go back in and reset up terms. So we took it away from the shareholders of the federal contractors, the capacity to legally set up a corporate structure for business. So we had to file copyrights on that, and we filed that at the United Nations and published worldwide. It was accepted at the United Nations, and we were given our sovereignty status, not from them because they couldn't give us sovereignty status. Sovereigns claim their status, right? Because the United Nations was a fraudulent organization. It modifies their grammar as well. It has no standing in the now space. Later on in life, I would get those conversations with the heads of the United Nations. And to get back to your point, so as bearer of the flag and owner of the flag, if I choose to set up terms and accept terms, I can hoist the colors anywhere in the world, and I'm accepted to deal in business, to business transactions, as well as negotiate trade and peace on a global level.
Now, does anyone else recognize that?
Everywhere in the world.
So they all know this.
Yes.
And they knew it then. All countries of the world understood at that time when you took the flag.
Not at that time, not until we sat down with them at the United Nations. Then they became knowledgeable.
So you gave them what you call closure at that point in time.
Yes.
Of the correct Parse syntax grammar filing and why that's important.
Correct. We sat down typically 2 hours to 4 hours per meeting. You know, ambassadors are very busy in their day-to-day lives at the United Nations. But some ambassadors called us back as many as 20 times to specific countries to have a conversation specifically with me about the quantum banking system and the ramifications for corporate structure of meritocracy on wharfs, docks, and quays. Right? And so those were wonderful conversations. They asked a lot of technical stuff that was designed in there of me, and I gave them the necessary closure so that they could pass that closure on to their Treasury departments.
Now, when you actually took the copyright and you filed the copyright, what did that give you differently than you had previously?
Well, it was the first time in the history of mankind that a flag was claimed in the now space. A flag had never been claimed in grammar in the now space. Now space is a very valuable tool. In our quantum grammar system, we study the word parse, which means we break words apart. We don't use future tense words like to, and we don't use adverbs to modify our facts, or adjectives or pronouns. We make them nouns. So we have a sequence of not being in past tense and not being in future tense, but maintaining the parameters of the grammar on paperwork, on contract, in a now tense scenario, which has never been done in the history of planet Earth. Each country, each corporation, and each person on the planet only wrote in modification grammar where they were using subjective interpretation on words because they were untrained in the mathematical interface on grammar.
And so there is actually a mathematical language that you discovered, or you...
And David.
Well, did you really discover that language, or is it something that they already knew and you just exposed it?
I have no knowledge of that because I don't know what other people know. So I can't answer that question. What I do know is we were the ones to publish it. We found it in a draft, and then I brought the now tense scenario to David, and we formed our partnership, and then it blossomed from there.
And what was the purpose of taking that on and actually correcting everything in the Parse syntax grammar?
Well, it gives closure on facts, and it does away with subjective interpretation, which gives fairness on the playing field and contract. So people can't argue about words, they know the terms, and they know the performances that need to be done, and upon those performances, now duties can be dealt out of accountability if need be.
So then you took the authorization and the copyright of the flag.
Yes.
At what point did you then take a next step and say, I'm now going to do something with this flag?
I walked into the U.S. Pentagon and leased them the flag.
What did they say at the U.S.
Thank
Pentagon?
you. You're the only citizen that cared and even knew about this. We didn't even know ourselves. Thank you. Thank you, Russell. Thank you, David. We didn't know.
That's powerful.